The lecture hall hummed with quiet anticipation as students trickled in, some clutching steaming coffee cups, while others shuffled through their notes. It was just another brisk Tuesday morning at Whitmore University, an institution renowned for its academic excellence and cultural prestige, nestled in the scenic landscapes of Oregon. Inside room 302, a class on cultural criticism was about to commence. This wasn't just any lecture. It was taught by none other than Professor Eleanor Grayson, a figure whose name sparked admiration and controversy in equal measure. Known for her unfiltered critiques and audacious lectures, Grayson had made a career out of challenging societal norms, often wielding the names of public figures to make her points sharper than ever. Amid the sea of eager faces sat a young man in the third row, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Tall and composed, his unassuming demeanor made him nearly invisible, despite his striking presence. Barron Trump, a name the world would instantly recognize, was doing everything in his power to remain unnoticed. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, he kept his head slightly bowed, hoping the world wouldn't see past the anonymity he had carefully constructed. Barron had come to Whitmore University with a purpose. Enrolling under an assumed name, he sought a life away from the towering legacy of his last name. A chance to explore ideas, perspectives, and experiences without the relentless glare of the public eye. But what began as a quiet pursuit of normalcy was about to spiral into something far beyond his control. The murmurs in the room quieted as Professor Grayson strode to the podium. Her presence commanded attention, the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice sharp and deliberate. "Today, we're going to delve into the concept of public image, how it's shaped, distorted, and often weaponized. And to bring this idea to life, we'll examine some real-world examples." Barron's posture stiffened, his expression neutral, but his mind alert. He had no idea where this lecture was headed, but he could already feel the tension brewing. Professor Grayson was no ordinary lecturer. She was a storm. With a doctorate from Stanford and a career marked by bold critiques, she had become a cultural commentator whose words were as admired as they were debated. Her lectures were famous for their fiery delivery, often leaving no room for ambiguity. Today seemed no different. As she began, Grayson expertly dissected the duality of public personas, the carefully constructed images versus the often inconvenient realities lurking beneath. The room was captivated. Students hung on to her every word, their curiosity ignited by her unapologetic delivery. But then the tone shifted. With the precision of a scalpel, Grayson introduced a name that made Barron's chest tighten. "Let's consider Melania Trump," she said, pacing the stage like an artist unveiling her masterpiece. A woman celebrated for her elegance and poise. But what does that say about us as a society? Are we so superficial that beauty and silence are the highest virtues we admire? A murmur rippled through the room. Some students nodded in agreement. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Barron remained still, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him, masking the subtle storm rising within. Grayson's tone grew sharper, her words laced with sarcasm. What about substance? Influence born from intelligence and action, rather than polished surfaces. Is this the standard we want for young women today? Barron's chest tightened further, though his face betrayed nothing. He had chosen this class to challenge his understanding of the world, to engage with ideas bigger than himself. Yet sitting here, listening to this scathing critique, he couldn't ignore the deeply personal undercurrent. The professor continued, her critique growing harsher with every sentence. She recounted Melania's every move, from carefully chosen public statements to the infamous jacket that read, "I really don't care, do you?" The class was enraptured, some chuckling at Grayson's biting commentary. "She's a symbol," Grayson declared, gesturing with purpose. But a symbol of what? A bygone era where women were expected to stand silently behind their powerful husbands, smiling gracefully and saying little of value. Laughter rippled through the room. Some students joined in, others exchanged knowing smirks. Barron, however, was still. His fists tightened under the desk as a torrent of emotions swept through him. He had watched his mother endure the world's judgments, from assumptions about her intelligence to critiques of her past. To him, she was more than the image people painted. A fiercely protective, deeply intelligent woman who carried the weight of scrutiny with quiet resilience. Grayson leaned into the moment, her words gaining a mocking edge. "What if," she mused, her tone dripping with irony, "we celebrated women who actually made a difference, instead of those who simply wore designer gowns?" The class erupted in laughter again, louder this time. Barron's heart pounded in his chest. He scanned the faces of his peers, some amused, others indifferent, but none questioning the imbalance of the argument. For Barron, this wasn't just a lecture. It was a moment of reckoning. He had spent years avoiding the public eye, letting others shape the narrative of his family. But today, the silence felt heavier than ever. Grayson's critique hit a crescendo. "And then there's the irony of a public slogan like, 'Be best,'" she continued, her voice laced with derision. A phrase so grammatically clumsy it makes you wonder. Was it a lack of understanding, or simply a lack of care? This time, the laughter stung deeper. Barron felt his face flush, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't anger, it was something more profound. Disappointment, frustration, the realization that even the most intellectual spaces could carry biases, wrapped in layers of wit and sarcasm. He thought of his parents' lessons. Stay composed. Never escalate. Let your actions speak louder than words. But this wasn't a time for silence. Taking a deep breath, Barron steadied his hand on the desk. Slowly, deliberately, he raised it. The professor froze mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the interruption. The room went silent. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped and expectant. Barron rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. Every eye in the room turned to him, the laughter evaporating into a tense hush. When he spoke, his voice was calm but resolute, carrying a quiet power that silenced any lingering murmurs. "I think there's something you've overlooked," he said, his words clear and measured. And in that moment, the lecture hall wasn't just a classroom. It became a stage for a confrontation no one could have anticipated. The room buzzed with a quiet energy as the lecture hall filled once again. Students whispered amongst themselves, recounting the extraordinary moment from the previous week. It wasn't just another day at Whitmore University. There was an unmistakable anticipation in the air. What had happened last week had transcended the bounds of a typical classroom exchange. It had sparked something deeper, something that still lingered in the minds of everyone who had been there. Barron Trump, sitting in his usual spot, remained his calm, composed self. He blended into the crowd, just another face among dozens. But those who had witnessed his words last week knew better. Barron had shattered the anonymity he worked so hard to maintain, not with fame or bravado, but with the quiet power of his conviction. Now, even as he sat silently, his presence carried a weight it hadn't before. Professor Eleanor Grayson, known for her sharp intellect and commanding demeanor, stepped into the room with a hint of hesitation. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but those paying close attention noticed it. Something had changed in her. The professor who had always prided herself on her unflinching critiques now seemed less sure, as if the words from the previous week were still echoing in her mind. The students fell silent as she approached the podium. She scanned the room briefly before speaking, her voice steady but reflective. "Good morning, everyone," she began. "Before we dive into today's lecture, I want to take a moment to address something that happened last week." A ripple of curiosity swept through the room. The students leaned forward, their attention now fully fixed on her. "Last week I was challenged," she continued, her tone softer than usual. "And not just on the subject of my critique, but on my approach. It was a moment that, frankly, I wasn't expecting. But as I've reflected on it over the past few days, I realized something important. Criticism without empathy is just noise." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a professor known for her fiery takedowns, this moment of vulnerability was as surprising as it was powerful. She turned her gaze briefly to Barron, her expression thoughtful. "I want to thank the student who spoke up last week for reminding me, and all of us, that understanding is as essential as critique. The students exchanged glances, their respect for the professor growing as they saw a new side of her. Barron, seated in his usual spot, simply nodded in acknowledgement. He wasn't one for grand gestures, and this quiet acknowledgement felt fitting. Grayson continued, her voice growing more confident. We live in a world where it's easy to judge, easy to mock, and easy to tear people down. But what's harder, and more meaningful, is to engage with ideas thoughtfully, to challenge assumptions with both respect and conviction. That's the lesson I hope we all take from last week. The room erupted into applause, the sound filling every corner of the lecture hall. It wasn't just a show of support. It was a recognition of the profound moment they had all been a part of. For the first time in a long time, the divide between professor and students felt less like a chasm and more like a bridge. As the applause died down, Grayson shifted gears and began her lecture. But the energy in the room was different now. The students were more engaged, their discussions more nuanced. The events of the past week had left an indelible mark on how they approached not just this class, but the world around them. Later that evening, the campus buzzed with conversations sparked by the lecture. Social media lit up as students shared their thoughts and reactions. The clip of Barron's words from the previous week had gone viral, and now the follow-up lecture was becoming just as talked about. Barron, however, remained as unassuming as ever. He walked through campus with his backpack slung over one shoulder, his hoodie pulled up, blending into the crowd, but the whispers followed him. "That's him," someone said, pointing subtly in his direction. "The guy from the lecture." Barron ignored the murmurs, keeping his head down as he made his way to the library. He wasn't interested in the attention. For him, the moment in the lecture hall wasn't about making a name for himself. It was about standing up for something he believed in, something he couldn't let go unchallenged. As the days turned into weeks, the impact of that moment continued to ripple outward. Discussions about public perception, empathy, and criticism took center stage across campus. Students who had never spoken up in class before found the courage to share their thoughts. Even the faculty took notice, with some professors referencing the exchange in their own lectures. But the most profound change was within Professor Grayson herself. Known for her sharp wit and unyielding critiques, she now approached her lectures with a newfound depth. Her critiques were still incisive, but they were tempered with compassion, an acknowledgement of the humanity behind the subjects she analyzed. One evening, as Barron walked back to his dorm, he found a small note slipped under his door. It was from Professor Grayson. "Thank you for challenging me. You reminded me of the power of dialogue and the importance of empathy. Keep speaking up, your voice matters," Barron read the note.